We'll talk about religion and science. So this speaker is a trained physician who practiced clinical pediatrics and neonatal intensive care for nearly 14 years in developing and developed countries before being involved in public health and global health policy. Before joining Columbia School of Public Health, Ahmed worked on health sector reform within the Ministries of Health in Egypt. Ahmed's public health activities have involved collaborating with and working with the World Health Organization, as well as others, in New York. He has co-authored several publications related to infections, CNS and pain, as well as health policy. Ahmed is also a senior researcher working on health outcomes research. Please welcome Ahmed Shelbaya.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me again. So I've been here, I think 3 years ago. I think it was the first conference for Muslimish. So I really appreciate being invited. So my talk today, and I really struggled once I was asked to come to the event. What exactly should I be speaking of, especially with the theme of having science and then arts? It was a bit challenging, given the context of what Muslimish do and how can we correlate what's happening and the mission of Muslimish in general. So what I thought of was actually try to exhaust my original thought that I don't necessarily have correct prescriptions for, but also the thoughts of the audience and specifically also our members with Muslimish, and whether there can be coexistence between religion and science. And the first two talks actually did lots of favor in terms of helping me complement what they're saying. So Zerard did, do a great job in terms of helping me make the case for the value of religion as he kind of put it in the context of emotions. Obeid made a very good point also of the importance of science and questioning and answering questions related to the universe and explaining why it doesn't behave in that manner. However, even though the two aspects and two points of view have very strong basis on how they stand for, but the coexistence still is very much in friction, and still the question of how can they coexist is a question that needs to be answered. So what I'll try today is first, as a sort of positioning myself where I come from, and I really appreciate what has been mentioned earlier in terms of the mission of Muslimish and how it evolved to really be a place for pluralistic opinions and not just ex-Muslims but Muslims as well. So that's where I will identify myself. And then I will try to attempt to understand why are there conflicts between religion and science. Then speak a little bit about the term no, and I'm sure that many of you kind of got exposed to that term, but just to review it together. And then try to understand maybe a roadmap or some thought process of trying to understand, is science the adversary of religion or religion the adversary of science, and what's the way forward? So as I was introduced, most of my career life was in science. I worked in different aspects of science. I was trained in science, and accordingly my training and my thought process definitely corresponds to what Obeid mentioned in terms of questioning, reasoning, having hypotheses and trying to experiment and try to change if the evidence presents itself otherwise. But I also identify myself as a Muslim as well. And definitely that's something that I get questioned, and especially when I moved here to America and the West, that question came into my face very much. How can I, have those two identities in harmony. And especially, as Abed mentioned, that in how religion identifies itself, it relates to faith and non-questioning and so on. But again, I pride myself as identifying as a Muslim and use it as a sort of a moral guidance, and it helps in my life in many ways. So going to the topic of that sensitive topic about the heated conflict between science and religion, and it's not something that is new, has been throughout history present. However, it was documented more towards the last 2 centuries, specifically when we always learn about what happened to Galileo and coming back from his theories related to science or the origins of species, or currently even the debate between creationism and evolution. So definitely there is that heated debate, and it has definitely very valued and valuable reasons for this. So as mentioned, science is based on evidence and drawn from examining the world. However, religion does not depend on empirical evidence, and in many instances relates to supernatural forces and supernatural entities which are not necessarily studied by science. So there is reason there, and of course the history of suspicion, from scientists towards religion is there from all of the events that we're thinking. But the question is that conflict really necessary? Is it religion, or is it dogmatic theology that is creating that friction? And again, aligning with what was mentioned in the earlier talk about the need for having the emotions and the need for having a way of explaining nature and the unknown in a different way than science uses. So the question again, is that necessary that there would be a conflict or not? That would be the case and would continue if there continues to be a try to overlap how to address certain questions in the same way using science and religion. That would be definitely a reason for continuing and necessity for continuing that type of conflict. However, there were different trials and aspects of trying to understand ways to have religion and science coexist in one way or another. That one, NOMA, was discussed by Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist and evolutionist. And the NOMA stands for non-overlapping magisteria, meaning that different domains have different means of teaching or explaining unknowns that not necessarily have to overlap, but have their own ways of addressing questions that are in need to be addressed by human society. So science, again, has its own magisteria of addressing what universe means in terms of facts, how does the universe behave in terms of why, and religion answers questions related to meaning, purpose, and maybe moral values, as Zerar kind of referred to in his talk. Gould, in his approach of trying to identify that way of coexistence between religion and science, relies on 2 main aspects: that they have equal status. No magisteria should exclude the other, but also that they are independent and they not overlap. That they do not necessarily have to justify one way of looking at truth or one way of addressing questions, but different ways of addressing questions that, again, humanity gets exposed to. The reasons for conflict still could continue, even with all the trials by Stephen Gould and others. And I think it has to do more with the authority of one over the other. And of course, throughout history, religion had lots of authority that was imposing itself on science or imposing itself on state policy and how people should behave. Science, again, with its capacity to answer questions in a very reasonable way, did not align with that way of authority that was done by religion. But also similarly, threatening human nature and the topics that were brought up in the first session or the first talk, in terms of that we are by design in need for emotions and a way of understanding the world in a different way. And religion or emotions allows for that. So similarly, forcing out religion or emotions is not necessary, will continue to create that conflict and warfare between religion and science. However, I also think that how the conflicts between the two magisteria, that the term that we want to use, the level of that conflict and addressing them also lends itself to continuing that conflict or arriving to a position where there could be some sort of understanding and acceptance of how to address different questions. So the level, at the literal level, so Abeid mentioned different verses of the Bible, of course the Quran, which I personally, of course, disagree and not attest to. If going towards that literal approach of difference and conflict will not lead to anywhere. A higher level would be the theories that come, of course, with science and trying to have them conflict with another. Definitely will continue the conflict at that stage. It is the model and perspective differences. I think that's where we can have a platform of understanding. That there are different models and perspectives of understanding the world, as long as it's not forced on the other, as long as it's not forced on society, whether through state policy or otherwise. I think that's where the level of conflict needs, or the level of discussion needs to be risen to, or raised to that standard in order to have some sort of platform to understand. Definitely, scientists are not, the best of them are not necessarily all in divorce of religion. And in some statistics, as I've gone through them, throughout the different decades, still there are, underscoring that 30 to 40% of scientists still believe in God and some sort of religion. And again, I won't go through the quote of Einstein, but it's sort of rising to the level of accepting a way that others question unknowns or lead their lives to in a way that could address the emotions and the needs of those that are not necessarily met by the reasoning of science. And again, I've used that slide in my past presentation. We're not living alone, and it's unfruitful to try to push out the way that others live, or to divorce religion and being extremely critical of it. There are definitely aspects of religion that needs to be criticized, needs to be reformed, but total divorce of religion, I don't think that would be a way of moving forward as humanity living with one another. So the battle ought to be not necessarily towards religion. I definitely agree that it's towards dogmatic theology. That's definitely the battle. The battle, as mentioned in the mission of Muslimish, addressing oppression, lack of freedom of speech, judgmentalism, lack of doubt and lack of critique, that's what needs to be addressed much more than fighting or pushing magisterial or a way of dealing with life in general. These are the things that I believe needs to be addressed. And I think where Muslimish now is, in terms of where it evolved throughout the past years, allows for that platform and allows for that discussion. And having me here definitely shows that there is no black and white. There is a rainbow that could definitely be enriching and complementary to one another. So the mission ought to be to develop citizens and empowered people who can have a critical, inquisitive mind, reject traditional social and political ideas, and hold fairness and equity as a whole thing to be valued. That's where I think the platform ought to arrive in terms of that discussion and the debate between religion and science, and definitely not overlap, but have two parallel ways of addressing lots of elements. And thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ahmed, for that talk. That was really great.